Hi, this is Kelly Glick, and this is our final assignment for EDL 851, the case study assignment. So we are going to start with a little bit of an introduction about the case and kind of summarizing what it's all about before we get into identifying the problem and coming up with an action plan. So this is about Mrs. Horton and also about Mrs. Wilson, but Mrs. Horton is an award-winning teacher who suddenly has some issues. She's a good teacher gone bad. Mrs. Wilson is the principal of the school, and I'm going to pretend to be her as part of this case summary. So part of the problem starts when Mrs. Horton, a first grade teacher at a small elementary school in a rural district, starts to show signs that are a little different than how she normally acts. In the spring of a school year, she starts to appear more stressed and is sort of snappy with other staff. Over the summer, even though it's not required, it's really unusual for her not to show up and spend some time prepping her classroom for the next school year. And so after degrading other teachers and really being in opposition to a new pilot reading program that the principal is trying to institute, the principal has an individual conference with Mrs. Horton, at which time she doesn't appear to be willing to change her actions or her opinions or kind of back down from her stance about the new program. So in the fall, there are pretty dramatically escalating concerns. There are numerous parent phone calls to Mrs. Wilson, the principal, about Mrs. Horton being late to class, not holding parent-teacher conferences, and the phrase verbal abuse is actually used in reference to how she treats the kids in her class. In addition, the superintendent caused the principal to let her know that there have been 4 different requests from parents in Mrs. Horton's class that their student be removed and placed in a different class. So finally, there is a parent-teacher conference with a 5th parent who would like his child removed from Mrs. Horton's class. And in that conference, Mrs. Horton is unprepared and is also rather hostile toward the parent, definitely showing some significant unprofessional behavior. So that's kind of the background of the case. And then we need to figure out what exactly is the problem and how we're going to address it. So what I know in this case is that there's definitely been there's been a pattern of reported verbal attacks and on both kids and parents and staff as well. In general, there's reports of Mrs. Horton being unprepared, both for meetings, conferences, and even school on a daily basis. We know that other coworkers have talked about there being a lot of stress at home, possibly an impending divorce, and some other issues. And so there's definitely stress that's in her life that may not have been there previously. And we also know from the one individual conference that was held that so far Mrs. Horton has not been willing to kind of shift her views or to problem solve around some of the issues that are arising. It also seems like she has a lot of concerns about switching gears or meeting program expectations. So like holding parent-teacher conferences would be an expectation, getting on board with a new reading program, and she's not really willing to go along with any expectations or even changes that are coming up. So there's a whole lot more I need to know that I don't know, and one is what I have the power to do if I were the administrator in this case. I think each district and each building is so different, and it varies widely on what disciplinary measures are allowed to be made, like what decisions are allowed to be made by the building principal as opposed to district human resources, or what union negotiations have been put in place. And so I don't know any of that. So it feels a little bit nerve-wracking to try and come up with an action plan, not knowing what any of those outside factors are in this case. And then the other thing is that I really don't know, like I don't have a lot of concrete evidence to look at Mrs. Horton's performance. And so because this has happened in less than a full school year, I can't really compare previous like attendance or performance numbers in her class or achievement ratings by students compared to this year. So my one option I might have is to compare other first grade classrooms with hers and look at student attendance in her class and performance rates in her class compared with kids in the other classes, if I even have that at this point in the school year, which I may possibly have that. So trying to come up with obviously there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about what's going on with her and kind of a lack of professionalism. I'm trying to look at, do I have any other kinds of evidence, any numbers that would also support a drop in her performance. And then I don't know if there's any other problems that kind of feed into this but are separate that are witnessed either by staff or parents. So I don't know also if there's good things going on that have been reported, if anybody's been thankful for her intervention with kids. So I don't have kind of that, that other information that would kind of give me big picture info about what's going on with Mrs. Horton. And then the other thing is, I don't really know her frame of reference. Does she feel like the whole world's attacking her? Does she feel like there's too much change? Is she unhappy with the change in leadership several years prior? Does she have a different dynamic with the staff, with the previous principal? So there's all kinds of things about her frame of reference that I don't know, because those things are important when it comes to conferencing and trying to join with somebody to create an action plan or solve a problem. I also don't know what happened after the parent left the parent-teacher conference. This is really vital because I don't know if, when the parent left, if Miss Horton continued to kind of rant and rave and not take responsibility for her behavior, or if she broke down and cried and talked about all the stress in her life and how she knows it's impacting her work. So that would kind of, even though my action plan would fit both kinds of reactions, it seems to me that my assessment and my reaction to her would be really different depending if she was angry and hostile and defensive, or if she was kind of vulnerable and open and identified like with the struggling piece of what was going on for her. So my problem identification in this case is that there's a lack of professional behavior and potentially there's harm to students. And so really my action plan centers a lot around, is there being harm done to students in this case? Because that seems to be the most concerning part of this whole case scenario. So moving on, what is my proposed plan of action? So I would most likely ask Miss Horton to go on a 2-week paid leave. There's a lot of reasons for this, and I'll get into it as we go through the different slides here. But obviously, I would definitely have to consult with HR around, again, if this is even allowable. And so part of the reason for that is it seems like at this point she's been unable to kind of step back, evaluate her behavior, and have a reasonable conversation about it. The other thing is that, at least in my district, we have something called EAS, which is Employee Assistance Services. It is a counseling service available to staff. And while most times that's very separate from HR, it's not part of staff records or anything like that, like personnel records, it is counseling service available even if you don't have school district benefits. To be able to support you and your family. In addition, every once in a while in our district, EAS gets involved with HR matters when requested to really provide kind of an evaluation for whether staff is emotionally stable enough to do their job. And so if Mrs. Horton agreed, my recommendation would be that she meets with EAS to be able to better inform myself and the district level administrators and HR whether or not she is emotionally stable enough to be able to fulfill her job expectations. So far this school year, it appears that she is not, but I would leave that up to the experts in that area. In addition, by referring to EAS, not only to assess that, most likely she would end up with a lot more outside support than she's currently receiving, and so that may help in the long term as far as the stress she's feeling outside of her job. So following that 2 week, I would want to have a return meeting. And my expectation of that return meeting would be that she has completed an apology letter to Mr. Stafford, the parent involved in that last parent-teacher conference, and that we would develop together an action plan that's related to a couple different factors. One component of the action plan would have to be around communication, what's expected as far as communication with staff and parents, and how to conduct that professionally. And another would be on basic job expectations, showing up on time, conducting parent-teacher conferences, and of course anybody from the union or EAS would be welcome to attend based on what Mrs. Horton would agree to. So in looking at professional education leadership standards, Standard 6 talks about as an educational leader, promoting the professional and personal health of staff. It talks about looking at their well-being and helping them establish work-life balance. And so the EAS piece is huge to me because I think that totally meets Standard 6. You're really looking out for staff well-being, work-life balance, that kind of stuff. So that is certainly why I included that piece in the action plan. Following her return, after that meeting, if all criteria were met for that meeting, then I would want to conduct more frequent walkthroughs, set up monthly meetings to review the growth plan, the action plan, and as part of that, I might want to look at some of the other evaluation tools that we learned about throughout this course, like video taping classes or other types of supervision possibilities that are out there, different kinds of supervision tools, so that I'm getting a lot of different looks at what's really happening in Mrs. Horton's classroom. The other thing is that, we think about this for kids, but it's true for all of us that are human beings that, we need somewhere from 10 to 20 positive remarks compared to every one negative one, because that's what our brain holds on to. And so if we don't have enough positives, we are going to be really stuck in all the negative feedback we're getting. And so the other thing that I would consciously do upon her return is to really look for strengths, to catch good behavior on her part. So when she is working with a kid in a kind way, when she does seem organized or prepared, to make sure to reinforce that, to notice it, to thank her for that, and maybe even to find ways to give her kudos in front of the rest of the staff to kind of restore her reputation with them as well, since she's been kind of nasty to them in the months prior to this whole incident. And the other thing that I would absolutely have to do, apart from the plan with specifically Mrs. Horton, is to also really communicate with parents and superintendent regarding some kind of plan. Like, obviously it would have to be confidential because it's a personnel issue, but also really need to reassure. We need to reassure the superintendent that the principal has control over the building and that there's a plan in place for working to remediate this unprofessional behavior, and also lots of communication with parents about the sub that would be coming in, the fact that Mrs. Horton would be out for a little bit, the fact that, perhaps there's other part of the plan, like putting other support staff or getting them to be more involved in that classroom, including the counselors, so that parents are reassured that there are positive, stable people in the classroom, and find ways to word that in a, again, professional, reassuring way that also really upholds confidentiality around whatever's going on with Mrs. Horton. In looking at how would this plan promote the success of all students, I think that, especially with first graders, change can be so difficult for young kids, and sometimes that can kind of throw them off their task time. But I also think that them having a short break from a teacher who is really somewhat toxic may give them a chance to kind of breathe a little bit and calm down some of the emotional reactions some of them are having. It may also appease parents. And so if when Mrs. Horton is on leave, I would absolutely want to find a substitute that could commit to the 2 weeks and possibly longer, and really have kind of one sub that's first go-to for her class, and so that there's some consistency for these kiddos who've kind of had a rough start to the school year. And I believe that that would promote the success of all students. I think that really supporting and evaluating, or having EAS evaluate Mrs. Horton's emotional state will certainly benefit the kids in her class. And really, if you think about the culture of a small school too, if Mrs. Horton is berating other teachers, quite possibly there's a lot of tension going on across the school. And by allowing her to take a little bit of a break and kind of evaluate that and maybe get a handle on kind of some of that emotional regulation piece for herself, it may decrease the work stress that other teachers are feeling. And we know that anytime teachers experience stress, certainly the kids in their classes do, and that impacts the ability of kids to be successful. And I think setting expectations across the board for all teachers in the school for professional communication and work ethic expected is important. And just by reiterating what a great school, this has been and how much we pride ourselves in our work and our good outcomes for kids, that needs to be kind of reestablished and reset so that it's not necessarily just a disciplinary piece for Mrs. Horton, but this is the vision and the culture for our whole school. Certainly this promotes the ability of